A man walked into Boden, Wyoming, on the first cold evening of October 1887, with no horse, no gun, and nothing on his back but a saddlebag that clinked like a small hardware store. He was sunburned past the ears, lean in the way of men who have walked too many days in a row, and when he stopped at the edge of the town, well, he did not drink. He opened the bag, took out a thin leather-bound book, and began to read from it in the failing light as if he had been doing it for years. He had walked 40 miles since Sunday. His tongue was a strip of leather. The well was 6 feet away. But he read. His lips moved over words nobody else in the square could have sounded out loud, because most of the people in Boden could not read at all. The book was a Bible. Half of one, anyway. The spine was broken. The first 60 pages were gone, torn out by the woman who had owned it before him, a woman who had died face down at her kitchen table with a stub of pencil in her hand. That had been in Laramie. That had been 2 springs ago. The rest of the book was soft at the edges from being carried in the same saddlebag through 3 states and a territory. His name was Caleb Marsh. He was 38. He had been run out of Copper Basin in late August for teaching a miner's boy how to spell his own name. The boy's father had come at him with a fence post. Caleb had not tried to explain. He had walked. The saddlebag clinked because it held more than the Bible. It held 3 McGuffey primers he had saved from the burnt schoolhouse at Sweetwater. It held a stub of chalk wrapped in a rag. And it held a thin slate, the kind teachers had carried west, that had cracked down the middle and been bound back together with copper wire by a man who had not owned anything else worth saving. Boden had 38 buildings. 16 of them were occupied. The mercantile was run by a woman named Beck, who had buried her husband 2 winters back and now stood behind the counter every day with a ledger she could not read and a pencil she could not put to useful work. She had been writing the same grocery list for 4 years in handwriting that was mostly guesses. The door to Beck and Sons, the largest cattle operation in the valley, was across the street. Harlan Beck, her husband's younger brother, ran it. Harlan had been patient for years. He had the paper drives and the contract language he could read, and he had the patience to wait for the homesteaders whose deeds they could not read to sign whatever he put in front of them. Patience, in that county, was a kind of rope. Before I go further, if you're listening tonight, from a kitchen, a porch, a long flat road outside Billings, somewhere warm and quiet, drop where you are in the comments. We walk into this story together, and stay through to the end. There is a line in here I think you will want to carry home. Caleb sat down on the stone lip of the well and kept reading. A boy of about 10, in a too large coat that had been his father's, drifted across the square and stood 5 feet away and watched his lips move. The boy was Arthur Pike. His mother was dead of the winter cough. His father worked the claim up the canyon. The boy could spell only what he could remember of his mother, which was B-A-K and M-A, and the fact that P-K had been written on a Bible he had never been allowed to touch. Caleb looked up at the boy. "You listening, son?" he said. The boy nodded, eyes wide. "What's a word you want to know?" The boy worked his mouth for a moment, then said, quietly, "The one on the livery sign." Caleb looked across the square at the painted board above the stable. "Livery," he said, slow. "Livery. 6 letters. Short I, then V, then airy, like the word berry. You say it back to me." The boy said it back. Caleb nodded once, and put his book down on the well stone. He had not had a student in 4 weeks. He had not had a meal in 2 days. He would teach both at once when the sun came up. He walked into Annie's mercantile that evening before the lamp was lit, and stood for a long moment in the warm biscuit smell of the store, and Annie watched him from behind the counter the way you watch a horse you are not sure of. He had a Bible, and he had a saddlebag. He set both down. "I can do a day's cleaning," he said, "or I can fix the split in your counter, or I can sit in your back room and read to anyone who wants to listen." Annie looked at him. She had not learned to read either, though her husband had promised her, before his heart gave out, that he would. "Why can you read?" she said. "Same reason anyone can," he said. "Somebody took the trouble." Annie looked at her ledger. She had written down BSK in 4 different ways. None of them were right. She let him stay. He slept in the back room that first night on a pile of grain sacks with his saddlebag buckled under his head, and in the morning she set a plate of cornbread and a cup of water on the crate beside him and watched him eat with the awful quiet of a man who had not been at anyone's table for some time. He thanked her the way you thank someone for a thing you suspect cost them more than bread. That morning, On the boards behind the mercantile, he wrote in chalk the letters of the alphabet. Tall, even, patient. He made each one the size of a man's hand. He made them the size a child could not mistake for anything else. By the end of the first week, he had 4 students. Arthur Pike, the widow Eula Trumbo, who wanted to read the letters her son had written home from the railroad. Old Simon Greer, who had been a printer once, in another life, and had not picked up a press in 30 years. And Annie herself, who stood at the side of the room and mouthed the words with the others, and felt something she had not felt since she was a small girl at her mother's apron strings, which was that a door she had not known was closed was being opened slowly from the other side. Caleb taught without ceremony. He did not lecture. He asked. He made them sound out the words on the grain sacks, on the flour barrels, on the burlap twine the broker had stamped with the name of the company. He taught them to hear the words before they saw them. He had learned, somewhere, that the ear would open the eye if the eye was afraid of the page. Eula Trumbo came every morning even though her eyes watered with the close work. The first letter she ever wrote in her life was to the boy whose grave she could not visit because she had no money for the train. She signed her name at the bottom in a hand that shook like a willow, but it was her own, untouched by anyone else's help, and Caleb did not tell her it was good because Caleb did not say good about lessons they had not yet earned. He said it would hold together. He said it would get to him. It got to him. Arthur Pike came every day with a pocket full of words he had pried off tins at the store. He had begun collecting words the way other boys collected arrowheads. By the second week, he had 104. By the third, he could read every sign on his street. Harlan Beck saw the chalk letters on the mercantile boards. He sent his man Jess Cooley to scrape them off the first night, and Annie scraped Jess Cooley out the door with a broom handle and never raised her voice about it. The next day, Caleb chalked them again. Harlan scraped them. Annie scraped Jess. Caleb chalked. This went on for a week. Annie never told Caleb she was doing it. Caleb never asked. By the 4th week, 13 people were learning. By the 5th, 22. By the 6th, the floor of the mercantile was almost always full, and Caleb was teaching from a plank set across 2 flour barrels, with the torn Bible propped against a coffee tin and a primer balanced on his knee. Annie had begun to put extra cornbread on the crate at noon. She had begun to wash the chalk rags without being asked. Then Harlan made his move, which was the move he had been making for years, and the town learned, all at once, exactly how far the trouble went. Harlan's move was a letter. He had written it 12 days before, had it read aloud by the Methodist circuit rider at the prayer house on a Sunday Annie could not attend. It was a county ordinance, dated 1879, requiring any premises used for regular assembly for instruction to post a license fee of $25 with the territorial clerk before the 1st of each quarter. The penalty was forfeiture of goods. The marshal, who did not read either, took Harlan's word the way most men in the county took Harlan's word, and agreed to enforce it on a Tuesday. Caleb was at the well working with Arthur on the word wagon when Jess Cooley came round the corner with a writ. He handed it to Annie, who stood in the doorway of her own store holding a broom and unable to read the thing in his hand. She passed it to Caleb. Caleb read it twice. He set the slate on the well stone. $25, he said to her, soft. Annie said, I know what it says. How much do you have? He said. 8, she said. Caleb considered it the way a man considers jumping into a river in November. He knew what Harlan had done. He knew that the writ was legal. He knew that if Annie lost her goods, she lost everything, including the cornbread she put on the crate each morning and the back room, where he had begun to sleep facing the wall, so the morning sound of her sweeping could be his first real sound of a day in years. I have made choices before this one, he said, calm. I can make this one now. I will go tonight. Arthur heard him from 3 feet away. The boy looked at Caleb the way a child looks at a person he has only briefly trusted and has already begun to need. But if you go, Arthur said, who's going to teach my father how to write his name? Caleb had no answer ready for that. You could stay, the boy said. I could, Caleb said. But the man who sent that writ is not done. He will do more. If I leave, he will stop. You have to believe me on that. Caleb knew this was true. He knew how men like Harlan wrote themselves into a town's pages. A drifter teaching reading was an embarrassment to a man who had built a cattle empire on the inability of others to read his contracts. A drifter teaching reading and being run off was a small object lesson in how Boden organized itself around powerful men. A drifter teaching reading and being quietly disappeared was a problem too great to count. Annie looked at him. She did not ask him to stay because Annie did not ask anyone for anything she had ever lost before. She set the broom against the door frame. "Where will you go?" she said. "South, perhaps," he said. "Toward the rail line." She nodded once, the way a woman nods when she has decided something she will not say aloud. Caleb picked up the Bible, the slate, the primers, the chalk wrapped in the rag. He put them back into the saddlebag. Eula Trumbo stepped into the light of the doorway. Simon Greer was behind her. Arthur was at the well. Two of the Pike girls came in from the woodpile. Caleb looked at them, and something happened in his face that did not suddenly manufacture itself, but built very slowly during his years of teaching. And that was the recognition that a man who walks away when they need him is not better than the next man. "I could sign that license," he said to Annie. "You don't have $25, she said. "No," he said. "Harlan will take the store," she said. "He will," Caleb said. "I won't have anywhere to teach from," she said. "Then we teach from the street," said Eula. "We did before." Annie looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Annie. The dry, cold October wind came from the canyon and smelled of pine resin and snow to come. "All right," Caleb said. "We stay." The marshal came Tuesday. He was 19 and did not yet know what reading meant to him or to anyone else. He told Annie that her goods would be inventoried on Friday unless she showed a paid receipt from the Laramie clerk. Annie showed him the broom. On Friday, Harlan's man, Jess, arrived at the appointed hour. He arrived alone. The marshal did not show. The marshal, who had walked 8 miles to ask his own mother whether $25 was a real fine or a Beck fine, had not come back from her porch. Jess coolly set down his own inventory book and looked at what was in front of him and walked away. It was Eula Trumbo who had walked those 8 miles. She had been admitted to the marshal's mother's porch and had sat down in a chair and had asked, politely, whether the law of the territory was actually fair. The marshal's mother was a reader. She had read the ordinance herself 11 years before and had kept the text in a drawer. The ordinance, in fact, exempted any instruction held on premises used primarily for trade. She sent the marshal the page by her grandson that afternoon, and the marshal read it, in his own kitchen, out loud, and got very still, and did not go back to work that week. Jess Cooley had not known this. Harlan, knowing or not, had not pressed the writ. The town had stayed. The town had read. Caleb had stayed. Now think for a moment, before we cross into the last of it, what you would have done in Annie's doorway, with the broom in your hand. Not the heroic answer. The true one. The one that costs you something you cannot name. Sit with that. Then come back. Harlan did not press the writ, but he did not drop the rope. The next week he did a thing more patient than a writ, and that was where the storm arrived, because the rope was still in his hand. He called a town meeting for the second Saturday in November. He posted it himself on the long pine board at Joe's saloon, in his own hand, in print so small that only he and the circuit rider could find their way through it. He put the bill of sale for Annie Beck's store on the agenda, line 14, between the road levy and the snow fence petition. He put a line item on the agenda labeled Unlicensed Instruction of Minors. That was line 7, and beside it, in pencils so faint it would not survive a hard wind, he had written the same words he had used on the marshal, forfeiture of goods. He did not invite Annie to speak. He did not invite Caleb to speak. He wrote the agenda. He set the rules. He sat back. The meeting was held in the upstairs of the livery, where they held funerals when the ground was frozen. The pressed hay underfoot smelled sweet. The loft ladder came down in 6 rungs that groaned under the boots of grown men. Harlan stood at the far wall with Jess Cooley and a man from Cheyenne who had the small, neat book of territorial statutes he had carried openly across the front of the room, like a knife he had not yet decided to draw. Caleb sat in the 3rd row with Annie on his right and old Simon Greer on his left. Arthur Pike climbed to the loft and knelt at the rail. Eula Trumbo sat on the floor at the back because the chairs had all been taken by Beck riders and men who owed Beck grain. Harlan ran the meeting the way he ran the cattle drives, with a voice that never raised and never needed to. He read out the ordinance. He read it again, slow. He invited the Cheyenne man to confirm it. The Cheyenne man confirmed it, thanked the chair, and sat down. Both men had spoken fewer than 40 words between them. Then Harlan invited anyone who wished to speak against the writ. The room went still in a way that rooms go still when there is a thing everyone knows and no one is willing to name. Annie had her hands in her lap. Caleb had his slate across his knees. Simon Greer had his hat in both hands, turned brim up, like a man holding a bowl. Arthur Pike climbed down from the loft. He walked to the front of the room, barefoot because his boots had been left at the door, and stopped in front of the Cheyenne man and said 3 words. "I can read it now." Harlan did not move. "Read what, son?" said the Cheyenne man. "The ordinance you brought," the boy said. "I can read it. I learned at the mercantile. Caleb taught me." The Cheyenne man looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the boy. The boy looked back at the Cheyenne man with that particular steadiness of a 10-year-old who has been quietly seen by a man who came to teach him and not by a man who has come to take anything from him. "Will you read it?" the boy said. Harlan said, quietly, "The boy may not have the standing." "Then I have it," Annie said, and stood. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not with a gasp. With the small, uncomfortable sound of 40 chairs adjusting to the weight of a woman standing up in a room full of men who had not invited her to speak. Annie did not read the ordinance. She did not need to. She reached into the basket at her side and took out a stack of letters. 31 of them, each one written in chalk on brown butcher paper, then copied in pencil by the writer in their own hand, then folded by the writer, then addressed by the writer to a person who had been waiting for that exact letter for the length of a winter or a year or a husband's absence. "These are letters Boden wrote," she said. "In November, the 1st. Every one of them signed by the person who wrote it. Every one of them read aloud in this room by the person who wrote it before we sent it to the post. Every one of them is allowed because the people who wrote them read what they wrote." She set them on the long table. The Cheyenne man, who had not come to Boden to defend a cattle operation, looked at the stack and said nothing for a long time. Harlan watched. The Cheyenne man reached out and took the first letter and held it at arm's length and read it, in his own voice, in front of the room, which was a letter from old Simon Greer to his daughter in St. Louis, and which said, in 3 lines, that he was alive, that he could write, that he loved her, that he had learned at the store on Tuesday. He set it down. He took the second letter. He read it. By the 6th letter his hands had begun to grip the page in the way of a man who has been handed a fact he cannot set down and cannot put back. He stopped at the 12th. He looked up at Harlan. "Mr. Beck," he said, "I had come here expecting this to be an enforcement. It is not. Whatever else you and I do today, I am not going to enforce this ordinance against letters to a daughter in St. Louis." Harlan did not move. Jess coolly shifted his weight. The Beck riders were looking at the floor. Arthur Pike climbed back up to the loft. Eula Trumbo at the back of the room had begun to cry into her sleeve, silently, the way women cry when they have been the strong one for a long time. Then Harlan said, in the voice that never raised and never needed to, that the matter was closed. He did not say wrong. He did not say right. He said closed. He said it because saying wrong would have cost him something he could not afford, and because saying right would have cost him something he would not have been able to live with. The room exhaled as a single body. Annie sat down. Caleb put his hand on her wrist. She did not take it back. "If anything hits you in this story, hit the like so the next one finds you. Subscribe if you want a quiet place to land every week. We are going to be all right." They walked out of the livery together in the late afternoon cold, Annie with the letters in her basket, Caleb with the Bible and the slate, Arthur beside them with the empty pockets where the words had been and the full mouth where they now lived. The snow that had been threatening for weeks began, very slowly, on the long walk back to the store, and Annie stopped at the well Caleb had been reading at the night he arrived, and she said, very quietly, that her husband had been afraid of the well in the dark, which was a true thing she had never told anyone, and that her husband had been wrong about a number of things before he died, and that one of those things had been that a person who could not read could not be loved for the labor of her own 2 hands, and Caleb nodded, and did not speak, because the moment did not need any more words in it than the ones Annie had already put there. The following winter was a long one. Boden went quiet under snow. Caleb stayed on. The lessons did not stop. They only moved indoors, where the chimney drew, where Annie could keep the kettle hot, where the board behind the mercantile, dressed in oilcloth, kept the chalk from freezing and held the letters they had been working on for months. By the first thaw, there were 41 people who could read more than they had known the autumn before. By the second thaw, there were 63. By spring of the 3rd year, every homestead in the valley held at least one person who could mark the brand on a Beck cow ledger and tell whether they had been paid in full. Harlan did not lose his cattle. He did not lose his name. He did, very slowly, lose his power over the things his neighbors could not read, and the losing of that was a quieter thing than anyone had imagined it would be. He had been writing deeds in a particular ink whose language only he could parse. By the third spring there were 3 people in Boden who could parse it better than he could, and 2 of them had been his own writers. He never apologized. He never explained. He did, once, walk past Annie on a Tuesday and nod at her, which was the closest thing to an admission that Boden had wrung out of him in a decade. He did not teach anyone to read. He never set foot in the back room. He never once asked Caleb to call him anything but Mr. Beck. And yet, by the spring of the 3rd year, the small leather-bound Bible that Caleb had carried in from Laramie rested, opened, on Annie's counter, between the coffee tin and the apothecary jar of fennel seed, and children came in after school to read aloud from it, 2 pages at a time, and Annie listened with her hands folded, and Caleb sat in the back of the room marking the slow page they had been on for months, and the smell of bread came in from the kitchen, and the snow melt ran in the street outside. And a man named Harlan Beck walked past the window on his way to the bank without turning his head, but slowly, slower than he had walked in years, and the slow speed of him was its own admission. And if it was not the admission Annie deserved, it was the admission Boden could afford. And Annie, who had buried her husband, and opened her store, and held the broom, and learned the alphabet at 42, understood that some things taken back are worth more than some things never lost, and was willing to be patient with the man who had taken them, in her own time, in her own doorway, in her own store. It is next week I am bringing you a woman who rides into a Nevada mining town with a satchel of letters addressed to men who never came home, and she sits in the only chair the sheriff offers her, and she reads them aloud, one by one, until there is no man in that room who can look her in the eye. Subscribe so you do not miss her. Sleep warm tonight.